Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right into it because today we are unraveling one of the most profound, almost unbelievable modern mysteries of our global economy. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly is it that an unbacked fiat currency, basically just a piece of paper, or these days a digital zero on a screen with absolutely no physical commodity anchoring it, manages to completely dominate international trade, finance, and global geopolitics? It's a reality we totally take for granted, right? Every single time we check a bank account, or buy an imported car, or even just fill up our gas tanks, we're interacting with it. But the foundation of our entire modern financial world is actually built on a massive shadow system. It is a wildly fascinating story, packed with extreme ambition, bizarre historical accidents, and a hidden parallel economy that quite literally rewrote the rules of money. So what does this all mean for us? Think of the narrative we're about to explore as a high-stakes economic thriller. We're talking about a story of massive unintended consequences, where a financial system that was meticulously designed by some of the smartest minds on Earth, locked away in a war room, ultimately survived its own fatal, deeply embedded mathematical flaw. As we'll see, a system that was meant to be tightly controlled and monitored actually birthed an invisible, completely unregulated offshore dollar economy. And that shadow economy grew so massive, it eventually swallowed the very framework that created it in the first place.
Okay, so to truly understand how we got here, we have to transport ourselves back in time to July 1944. I want you to picture the Mount Washington Hotel tucked away in the beautiful granite peaks of New Hampshire. Inside the hotel, it's midsummer, it's sweltering hot, and 730 delegates representing 44 allied nations are just crammed into these smoke-filled rooms arguing endlessly over exchange rate mechanisms. But outside this sterile boardroom, the world is quite literally on fire. The Second World War is still grinding toward its incredibly bloody conclusion. The Pacific Theater is burning, hundreds of thousands of men are actively fighting and dying in the exact same weeks that these well-dressed finance ministers are sitting at mahogany tables, calmly redesigning a world that doesn't even exist yet. It is a stunning, almost surreal juxtaposition. They are attempting to build the architecture of lasting peace atop a world that is still actively being destroyed.
Now, at the dead center of this sweltering hotel, you basically had a heavyweight title fight between two formidable minds, both fighting for the future of global power. In one corner, you had John Maynard Keynes of Britain, easily the preeminent economist of his generation. Even arriving in pretty poor health, Keynes sketched a truly revolutionary idea, a brand new global central bank that would issue its own entirely neutral currency. He called it the Bancor. His ultimate goal here was to prevent any single nation from holding permanent economic dominance. He wanted to force both creditor and debtor nations to actually share the burden of trade imbalances. But in the other corner was Harry Dexter White, the chief U.S. delegate. And White? Well, he wasn't interested in shared burdens at all. He wanted the U.S. dollar to be the absolute, unquestioned anchor of the New World Order, rigidly fixed to gold, with every other global currency forced to orbit around it like planets around the sun.
And you know what? Harry Dexter White won the argument. He won it for one simple, overwhelmingly powerful reason. By 1944, the United States held an estimated $26 billion in gold reserves. Let that number sink in. That was roughly 80% of all monetary gold held by the Western Allied powers at the time. While Britain had completely liquidated its centuries of wealth just to survive the war, and continental Europe lay in absolute industrial ruin, America emerged with its productive base not just intact, but dramatically, massively expanded. Keynes absolutely had a beautiful, elegant economic theory, but at the end of the day, America held all the industrial cards and quite literally, almost all of the gold. Because of that overwhelming, undeniable leverage, White's vision became the new global reality. On July 22, 1944, the famous Bretton Woods Agreement was officially signed. This landmark agreement officially named the U.S. dollar as the world's undisputed reserve currency. The mechanics of it were fairly straightforward, but absolutely profound. The dollar was fixed to gold at a strict rate of $35 per troy ounce, and every other participating nation was then legally mandated to peg their own currency directly to the U.S. dollar. So, with a simple stroke of a pen, Britain's post-war decline was locked in stone. The vast empire of global finance officially packed its bags and moved from London to New York. The United States was now sitting comfortably at the absolute center of the world's economic architecture.
But here's the catch. A system built on fixed exchange rates had a massive ticking time bomb hidden right inside its foundation. A Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin actually identified this exact flaw in 1960, and it famously became known as the Triffin dilemma. Triffin realized that for the post-war global economy to actually function and rebuild, the rest of the world desperately needed US dollars for trade. It was a massive structural conflict. Think about it. To get those dollars into foreign hands, America had to constantly buy more goods from the world than it sold, meaning they had to run perpetual balance of payments deficits. But here's the fatal flaw in the math. The more dollars America pumped out into the world, the worse the ratio of outstanding paper dollars to physical U.S. gold reserves became. Pumping out the dollars essentially guaranteed that there would eventually be a massive run on America's finite gold supply.
And the math ended up proving Triffin right, with terrifying, undeniable speed. Back in 1948, everything looked fine. The U.S. had plenty of gold sitting in vaults to easily cover its foreign dollar liabilities. But jump ahead to 1959, and that safety cushion was getting terrifyingly thin. And then we hit the absolute critical point, the 1964 crossover. For the very first time in history, outstanding foreign dollar liabilities completely eclipsed the actual value of the physical gold sitting inside Fort Knox. Technically speaking, as a global reserve currency that was legally required to be backed by gold, the dollar was now fundamentally insolvent. If all the foreign central banks suddenly knocked on America's door and demanded their gold all at once, the U.S. simply could not pay them.
So you might be asking, how on earth did all those dollars accumulate overseas so quickly in the first place? Well, it came down to the sheer, unprecedented scale of American geopolitical ambition. First, you had the Marshall Plan, which deliberately injected over $13 billion straight into Western Europe to stave off economic collapse and stop the spread of Soviet influence. Then came the Korean War, which spread massive American military bases and lucrative procurement contracts all throughout Asia. And eventually you had the Vietnam War, which saw tens of billions of dollars flooding out of the U.S. economy year after year. The U.S. government was essentially trying to do the impossible, finance massive overseas military campaigns while simultaneously funding huge domestic social programs back home. This wasn't just abstract economics in a textbook. These were massive wars and global programs that permanently rewired exactly how money flowed around the globe, rapidly accelerating the inevitable collapse of America's gold backing.
Alright, so while the official, rigid Bretton Woods system was visibly beginning to crack under all these incredible pressures, something entirely unexpected was quietly growing in its shadow. In a massive, almost unbelievable twist of historical irony, the Soviet Union actually helped build this new system. During the Cold War, the Soviets were terrified that the U.S. might freeze their dollar assets during a crisis, but they still desperately needed those dollars for global trade. So to protect themselves, they started depositing their dollars into European banks, specifically in London and Paris. At the exact same time, British banks discovered a huge gaping loophole. You see, British banking regulations tightly controlled their own currency, the pound sterling, but they had absolutely zero jurisdiction over foreign dollar deposits. This was the accidental, totally unplanned birth of the Eurodollar market. Nobody designed it. It was created entirely by actors simply trying to dodge regulations, avoid domestic interest rates, and navigate Cold War politics.
Let's break down exactly how this Eurodollar loophole worked, because it was an absolute game changer for global finance. It basically worked like this. Let's say an American corporation had a bunch of extra cash. Instead of depositing those dollars in a New York bank, they'd send them over to a London bank. Why? Well, because that London bank wasn't burdened by strict U.S. Federal Reserve regulations or reserve requirements, it could afford to pay the corporation a significantly higher interest rate on their deposit. That London bank could then turn right around and lend those exact same dollars to a European company at a lower rate than what the U.S. markets were offering. It's a win-win for them. The entire transaction happened seamlessly in U.S. dollars, but it happened completely outside the reach, the view, or the control of the United States government. It was essentially an invisible, incredibly lucrative offshore escape hatch for capital.
And let me tell you, this unregulated market didn't just grow, it exploded like a supernova. By 1970, the estimated size of this invisible offshore dollar economy was a staggering $100 billion. To put that into perspective, that number actually exceeded the total domestic money supply of most individual nations on Earth at the time. In less than 2 decades, the Eurodollar market morphed from a quirky, accidental regulatory anomaly into a massive, structurally embedded, parallel financial system. And what's absolutely wild is that it was reaching this monumental, world-changing scale right at the exact moment that the official gold-backed dollar system was buckling and groaning under the immense weight of the Triffin dilemma.
Eventually, the pressure cooker just exploded. The system broke. Global speculators were relentlessly attacking the dollar, and countries like France were aggressively demanding actual physical gold for their paper dollars, calling America's bluff. On the weekend of August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon huddled in secret with his top economic advisors at Camp David. And on Sunday evening, August 15, he went on live national television and dropped an absolute bombshell on the world. He announced the immediate suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, just like that. In a single 15-minute televised address, the 27-year-old foundational promise that had been made at the Mount Washington Hotel was shattered overnight. The dollar was officially no longer as good as gold. It was now just a piece of paper backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the U.S. government.
What followed this announcement was immediate, cascading global chaos. Without that shiny gold anchor holding everything in place, the financial world entered a period of deep, terrifying confusion. In December 1971, diplomats scrambled and created the Smithsonian Agreement, which tried to just slap a Band-Aid on the crisis by establishing new fixed exchange rates. But it was completely useless. It collapsed within 14 months. By March 1973, major global currencies just gave up and were forced to float against each other in the open, volatile market. And then came the absolute knockout punch, the late 1973 OPEC oil embargo. Global oil prices quadrupled in a matter of months. The world was suddenly plunged into a grueling, miserable decade of what economists call stagflation, which is this painful, incredibly toxic combination of high inflation, stagnant economic growth, and rising unemployment that orthodox economics couldn't really explain at the time.
But here is where the story takes a crazy turn. Amidst all of this economic chaos, the unbacked fiat dollar didn't die. In fact, the global economy actually doubled down on it. Why? Well, it was because of a very quiet, incredibly informal geopolitical masterstroke. In the wake of that crushing oil crisis, the U.S. engaged in highly secretive negotiations with Saudi Arabia. The resulting arrangement was brilliant in its sheer simplicity. Saudi Arabia would agree to price all of its global oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars, and then take their massive surplus revenues and invest them safely into U.S. Treasury securities. In exchange for this, the United States guaranteed absolute military protection for the Saudi regime. Soon after, other OPEC nations followed suit. Almost overnight, a brand new, totally non-gold mechanism was created, one that still deeply, profoundly influences global politics today. Think about it. If you wanted the oil that literally powered modern human civilization, you had to have US dollars to buy it.
Now, this new petrodollar arrangement fed right back into that massive shadow banking system we talked about earlier. OPEC nations were suddenly flooded with unprecedented, almost unimaginable billions in these new petrodollars. So where exactly did they put all this astronomical wealth? You guessed it, they deposited it straight into the unregulated Eurodollar banks sitting in London, Zurich, and New York. Those banks then acted like a massive, supercharged global engine. They were vacuuming up all this Saudi oil wealth and aggressively turning right around and loaning it out to industrializing, developing nations, countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, who desperately needed capital to grow. The Eurodollar market was efficiently recycling the world's wealth, sure, but it was also quietly creating a deeply fragile, highly volatile web of international debt in the process.
Fast forward to the late 1970s, and U.S. inflation is just spiraling totally out of control, actively threatening to destroy whatever fragile faith the world had left in this unbacked fiat dollar. Enter Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker in 1979. Volcker looked at the situation and initiated a drastic, deeply painful strategy to save the currency. He decided the Fed would strictly target the money supply, letting interest rates rise as high as the free market demanded in order to totally choke off inflation. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was intentionally forcing the United States economy and everyday consumers into a severe, brutal recession. It was a massive, calculated gamble. He was prioritizing absolute price stability and saving the global credibility of the dollar over any kind of immediate economic growth or comfort.
The brutal reality of this, known as the Volcker shock, was purely mathematical, and it was staggering. By June 1981, the U.S. federal funds rate hit an agonizing 20%. 20%! Imagine trying to buy a house when mortgage rates soared well past 18%. The global ripples of this policy were devastating, particularly for that fragile, debt-heavy Eurodollar credit system we just discussed. Those developing nations in Latin America that had happily taken out massive floating-rate Eurodollar loans in the 70s, they suddenly saw their interest payments violently multiply overnight. They were trapped. In 1982, Mexico had to announce it simply couldn't pay its debts. Brazil and Argentina quickly followed. The Volcker shock successfully killed American inflation, but it violently cracked the global system and sparked a devastating, decade-long developing world debt crisis. And yet, against all odds, despite the brutal debt crisis, despite the runaway inflation of the 70s, And despite the total severing of the gold tie, the entire system held together. The dollar didn't collapse. International trade, commodity pricing, global corporate debt, it was all already so completely intertwined with the dollar that it was essentially trapped. The global system simply couldn't abandon the greenback because the sheer cost and chaos of transitioning to some unknown alternative would have been completely catastrophic for everyone. The Volcker shock definitively proved that the dollar had found a brand new anchor. It wasn't shiny physical gold in a vault anymore. It was the unquestioned, hard-won credibility of the Federal Reserve's commitment to fighting inflation, combined with a vast financial infrastructure that was now so deeply, irrevocably embedded in the daily functioning of the entire world that it had literally become indispensable.
So, looking back at this incredible, turbulent history, historians generally fall into three distinct camps when trying to explain exactly why the dollar remains so dominant today. And it's really vital we look at all three of these impartially. The first perspective is strategic design. This is the belief that the U.S. intentionally, aggressively engineered Bretton Woods and the subsequent petrodollar system specifically to enforce its global financial dominance and fund an empire. The second camp is systemic drift. This is the idea that honestly no one planned this at all. The Eurodollar shadow market simply exploded through unstoppable natural market arbitrage, and the dollar remains dominant today purely because of the immense, sticky network effects of being the incumbent. Everyone uses it because everyone else uses it. And the third perspective is war economics, which is the rather fatalistic view that because the US was the sole intact industrial survivor of World War II, its massive monopoly was simply inevitable, and we are just currently living in the long, slow, multi-generational erosion of that massive 1945 advantage.
Each of these three perspectives offers a truly compelling lens through which we can view the shadow greenback. The historical record gives us the hard facts, of course, but the actual interpretation of those facts, that is entirely up for debate, and reasonable minds absolutely disagree. So, as you look around at the modern economy today, with the unbacked US dollar still reigning totally supreme over global trade, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to really ponder. Was the total dominance of the US dollar a meticulously planned, deliberate architecture of global power? Or was it merely the wildly unintended, chaotic consequence of a few delegates in a sweltering New Hampshire hotel simply trying to stabilize a collapsing world? It's a huge question, and it is absolutely worth sitting with. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the invisible systems that shape our world.